The Washington Talking Book and Braille Library is working to ensure equitable access to reading for everyone. You can help by donating your car, truck, or boat. It's free and easy. Go to careasy.org/WTBBL.
Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. In honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we're going back in time to 2011, when writer Karen Tei Yamashita stopped by our studios for an interview. At the time, she had recently released her book, I, Hotel, a novel set during the final years of San Francisco's International Hotel. It was an affordable stay, particularly for Chinese immigrants and Filipino migrant workers of the early 20th century. Yamashita employs poetry, playwriting, and extensive research to tell this story, and she talked about it with our audiobook production supervisor and my boss, John Pai. Here's their conversation.
Today in studio we have Karen Tei Yamashita, author of several works. Previous works are Through the Arc of the Rainforest, Brazil, Maru, Tropic of Orange, and Circle K Cycles. And you're on tour right now talking about your new work, I, Hotel. And in the past, there's been a lot of description of your work as novels or fiction, but there seemed to be a lot more history involved in there, in the sense of real history.
Well, in particular for I, Hotel, there's about 10 years of research that I did for the work, and that meant going into a number of archives and looking at the old newspapers and posters and materials, reading all the material from the period that surrounds the 60s and 70s, and also having conversations with way over 100 people who were participants in the movement.
Now, kind of backing up a little bit, so that our listeners can know what I, Hotel is about. It's kind of the centerpiece of the book is
the I, Hotel. And the I, Hotel is short for the International Hotel. It was a hotel that actually was built at the turn of the century, the 1900s, and was a hotel in San Francisco on Kearny and Jackson Street, if you know San Francisco, and was really between the North Beach area, which is famous for the Beats and City Lights and those guys, Ginsberg and Kerouac, and Chinatown on the other end. And Kearny Street was an old street which on both sides had a lot of Filipino businesses. So it was an old Manila town or a Filipino town. And the I, Hotel was a location that a lot of migrant workers would come to stay. It was a single residency occupancy hotel. So the men who were working up and down up in Alaska doing the cannery and doing all the asparagus picking and the work in the fields would come in with their wages, stay at the hotel, play pool, get a haircut, do some gambling, go dancing, go to the shows, and the hotels where they stayed. By the 60s, these men had become old and they had no families, so they took up residence in the hotel. By then, the hotel was pretty old and pretty dilapidated, but they could stay there for, I don't know, maybe it was $50 a month. So their Social Security checks would pay for that. And there was a Filipino community down, on the streets. They could go to their pool halls. They could sing their music. They could, get something to eat and have a community there. And so by the 60s, it was, I don't know how many people were living in the hotel. They were mostly Chinese and Filipino bachelors from that period. So that's the hotel.
And out of that centerpiece, you kind of weave this history or tale, or the telling of the tale of a development of an Asian American consciousness.
Yes. So the hotel is a symbolic center for the Asian American movement as it is born in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And so in 1968 and 1969, UC Berkeley and San Francisco State were the two sites where there are protests for third world movements, but third world colleges. So those two universities gather Asian Americans, Chicano Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and African American, Black Americans, and they start these third world protests to start colleges and the study of. And so it begins there, but also it bleeds out into all the communities. So it bleeds out into Chinatown and to Japantown and Filipino town. And the hotel is an interesting spot because it's between Chinatown and it is in Manila town. And activists go out to the hotel because about at the same moment, the hotel is being threatened by the owner who wants to tear it down to build a parking lot. And so that means that all these men will be evicted. And so, in particular, Filipino American students and activists and people in the community come out to think about saving the hotel and beginning to recognize the lives of these old men and their history in America. And has a lot to do, of course, with reading Carlos Bolosan, America's in the Heart. Those stories belong to these men. And so there are oral history projects that go on. And then there's the movement to stop the tearing down of the hotel and to stop the eviction of these men.
Now, the growth of that consciousness, though, is in like 1968 in the midst of the civil rights movement, which is kind of also the impetus for finding out who we are, who you are, what we need to be doing. And as a younger person at that time, I also felt that search. Where is my place as an Asian American? I don't think we even knew what Asian American was in the lexicon back then. It was kind of like
right. It was invented about then. It was invented a little before then. And so, yes, it was a part of a movement for identity, for communities. And then, as you know, there was the Vietnam War was going on. So Asian Americans identified with the troubles of that war and stopping the war because they felt it was a genocide against Asian people. And then, of course, the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong were in power at the time. People were very interested in China. And there was a lot of reading of Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists and that history of the Chinese Revolution. And that interest brought in an idea of the whole idea of serve the people. Well, serve the people was very much behind this identity with the community. So Chinatown's an old community. The Chinese American youth who came out of that community and were now at Berkeley and at SF State came back to the communities and said, wait a second, what can we do to serve our communities? We have a lot of problems here. There are health. Can we start health services? What kinds of services in terms of child care, activism for those women who are in the garment district? All of those things started to swell in this period. So there was an active movement coming back to communities and to actually save communities because all of the ethnic communities of this period, Chinatown, Japantown, Manila town, were under threat of redevelopment because they were named areas of blight so that the city could tear down buildings and redevelop them. And students came back and said, no, these are the homes of people. You can't just cast them out and evict them. Where will they go? And what will you build in to replace their homes? So, you can see how this sort of snowballed into different aspects for different people who became active in these communities.
Well, and the amazing thing too is that there's so many different threads and so many different genesis for where the ideas come from and where you're thinking. So it's not just within the civil rights movement, but it's beyond that, because it's also everything that was happening in Asia, and how do you take the whole idea of freedom and serving your community and serving people and preserving, and where do you go with that? And that's what I thought was so amazing, in how you actually took that time period and kind of really bring it out in a way that is beyond just a textbook. I mean, you could say that the I Hotel, the novel, is a textbook. You could use it as a textbook because everything in there is the history of that time period from 68 to 77 of this growing movement, of this activism within the communities. It's amazing how you also were able to structure it so it doesn't read like a history. It reads like jazz. It reads like stream of consciousness. Sometimes I was kind of wondering, where was the narrator from? Is it third person? Is it first? It kind of shifts around, or is it somewhere else? Because I found myself thinking about that. With these characters who are so clearly drawn, they're based on all these oral history interviews that you actually gathered. Is that correct? Or?
That's right. They're based on the stories that people told me. They're also based on the stories people didn't tell me. So the gaps in those stories. So in that respect, it's a fiction. I had to fill in the gaps to make the story have transitions and linearity. But I guess what you're talking about, there are multiple narrators in the book, and that was my attempt to have sort of a kaleidoscope of perspectives, because I didn't think that it could be told by any one narrator or one point of view, that the points of view were multiple. So you might have an activist who was involved, but whose political ideology was really more strict and more focused. Whereas you might have had an artist or a musician whose vision about how his participation might, or her participation might be, was very more fluid, more influenced by other aspects that had to do with aesthetics and art, the cultural milieu at the time. And who's to say whose perspective was more true? Everyone's perspectives move about the book to give you sort of a total vision of what it was like to be there at the time.
Now, were you living in the Bay Area at that time, or did you have any firsthand personal stories and connections to it directly, or was it all through research and friends and people we all know and stuff?
Most of it, I would say, was through research. Both that I was born in Oakland, but I spent I really was raised in Los Angeles, so I'm an LA girl. But my families, on both sides of my parents' families, are from San Francisco and the Oakland, the Bay Areas. And so every summer I would be in San Francisco Bay Area hanging out with my cousins and going places. So it isn't as if I didn't know the space and the people. But when I came to teach at UC Santa Cruz, it's about an hour out of San Francisco, I thought that I would make use of the fact that I had moved out of Los Angeles and closer to the Bay Area to learn more about the geography of the place and its history. And so I used that opportunity to, keep driving into the city and meeting people and walking around and wandering and getting on transportation and just getting the feel of the city again and trying to remember, the summers that I had spent there with my cousins and what was going on there that I was sort of privy to but not really involved in. For instance, I didn't go to Berkeley, or I didn't go to San Francisco State, so I didn't know. And then I started to interview people and talk to people, and that blossomed into a different kind of knowledge about the space.
Actually, from your perspective, I think you were able to really hone in and really bring out the feeling, the place. It really seems like that I'm kind of transported back to that time period. The language, the dialogue, the way of thinking. It's all, because it's a different way of thinking we all thought back at that time. And it was kind of, certain times there was like limiting because we don't know what we know now, or how things would play out. And I thought it was an amazing time capsule that way. Plus, it was so real. I kind of was a San Francisco wannabe. I grew up in New York City.
Okay.
And growing up Asian American on the East Coast is way different. Hear about what's happening on the West Coast. When I saw iHotel, anybody of of our generation knows immediately what that means.
Okay.
And how important that the fall of the iHotel was and what it meant, to that time period. And it really makes me feel that, wow, I'm here now. I finally made it. I was trapped in, I was in New York City, and then I was in Chicago, and I finally made it out to the coast, and here I am. So I thought that was really amazing. And, collaborating the way you did with an artist as well as the poetry in here is...
Well, the poetry is probably, it's mine, but it's also a parody of the kinds of writing that was, much of the literary aspects of the book, or what I was trying to do with it, would be to parody the time. So to make you think that you're back then. And of course, I couldn't lift material from other people, but I wanted to give a sense of the kind of the mindset or the intellectual trajectories that people were trying to take at the time. And I tried to, there's some sense of a satire in it. I'm not, it's hard to write, 30 years later about a period and not find it amusing.
Well, there's a lot of things that are amusing. I mean, how do you write a article about the university president and kind of put it in terms that's maybe readable as opposed to like theoretically kind of, mapped out?
Right. So yeah, that could be very boring. Yeah.
And that's where I kind of think, looking at a lot of Asian American works, that this jumps out at me in the sense that it tells history, but it's not painful, in the sense that sometimes, with nonfiction, you have to really slog through a lot of things, and there's a lot of freedom you may not have in storytelling. I'm wondering what is your role as the storyteller?
When the first book that I thought was historic fiction that I wrote was Brazil Maru. And Brazil Maru, similarly, I interviewed, I've interviewed hundreds of people or had conversations with them. And I learned how to do that work in those years. And that was way back when, in Brazil, where I was interviewing and talking to Japanese Brazilians. And I thought that what I was doing was a historic fiction at the time. But I also learned with that book how to tell stories. I knew that part of my job was also to take these stories, but then to recreate them again in a form that would be readable or recognizable to the people who had told me the stories. And I did not want in any way for this book to be unreadable. It could have been more experimental than it is. It's quite experimental, but I want it to be experimental in a way that you would get it, that anybody who picked it up would say, oh, I can read, novella 5 and I'll figure it out. And so that was my idea. And that storytelling would be a way to reveal something about a historic period. But, as time has gone along, since I wrote Brazil Maru and I come to do this book, I begin to think about what fiction does for history or our memory, and what it is that we're doing when we write and we remember some, part of our past. And one of the things about literature or fiction or poetry or any kind of aesthetic form that people engage in and are sometimes not known to others as official histories, is that those work actually tell us things that have been silenced by history. Well, history has to be official in some ways. It has to be documented. It can be only what the person documents. But I think also part of history, or at least our memories of it, is what we ate. It's also what things smelled like. What were the sounds of the street as we walk through it? That recuperation is always lost to a book of history. It's not necessary to the book of history. I think more and more maybe historians are trying to pull those kinds of representations in, but it's the work that fiction can do that has a kind of truth that recreates a period of time which is not necessarily entirely the truth or the facts, but it has a kind of truth or an honesty that reveals something a larger picture of a period. And I think that's what I want to work for, so that it's, first of all, readable or recuperable by the people who lived it, and that it will also generate more stories. I think already, just from traveling around and talking to people who live the period, I've been hearing more stories. They'll say, oh, that section that you wrote, that reminds me of this. And I think that that's beautiful. I'm really excited by that, this greater generation of stories. I feel that this book, despite the fact that it's kind of a doorstop and it's really huge.
600 pages, yes.
Yeah. I feel, though, that it's just the tip of an iceberg, or it's a tip of something that's really much greater, and that the participation of thousands of people in all sorts of aspects of the lives of a few of these characters, and even though there are many, that it's just a suggestion of what might have happened. So that's sort of a long way of talking about history.
But, the history, though, the fact that you did so many oral histories, what is really history? It's just, who is the historian? Is this somebody who sits someplace and say, oh, these are the facts, I'll just write it this way, and I'll make a chart. And look here, date 19, whatever, this happened, this happened. But it's almost as if it's breaking back down history to where history has always been, is through the tradition of oral history and stories that have been passed on from generation to generation. In the first piece, the first novella, the whole fact of having Walter Cronkite, all these little things that for myself growing up at that period, it just brings you back almost immediately. The smell, the sounds, what's happening, what's going on in the background, the subtext of the Vietnam War, which is always back there, going on the back of your mind for whatever's happening in front of you. The statistics, 15,000 versus 3,000. It's the daily Thursday statistics that happened on the East Coast at 7:15 during the report of Walter Cronkite would come on.
Right.
That would be the weekly tally.
Right.
All those things, and that was history, and that did happen. And it's not as if, we can, talk to the Texas school board and say, what was history? And obviously they have an obvious certain idea about what history is. Whatever happened to Thomas Jefferson, I don't know. Anyway, didn't he write the Declaration of Independence? Somehow he disappeared. But anyway, that's why, for me, it just kind of has that ability to jump to that where it just kind of lives more inside of you and actually can resonate in a different fashion.
Thank you. That's nice to know.
Now, this is your fifth piece, your published piece. And I think, through the years, you've actually kind of branched out. There's kind of like a definite kind of, I wouldn't say pattern, but evolution in how you write and how you create. Would you be interested to really kind of go more and break the boundaries of where you have just kind of like a straight literal form as experimental, as far as your future? I mean, where do you see this evolving you as an artist?
Well, I think that over the years with the different books, one of the things that I experimented with was the narrative voice, has been the narrative voice. Because once I realized that if you could figure out what the voice of the character or the voice of the storyteller would be, you would know how to project or continue the work on the page. It's a writerly problem. And I began to experiment with the first person, the I narrative. But then, who is the I narrative? You still need a character for that I. And that I character could be many people or many individuals, different. So with every book, I experimented further with that narrative voice. With Tropic of Orange, which was about Los Angeles, I had 7 narrators, and that was sort of experimental to that book. But each of the voices had a particular vernacular and a textual quality that signaled that that person was speaking on the page, and also you would hear it, the cadence of the voice. It was a structure that I created for the voice with rules that I knew I would repeat throughout their voices. So this has been an experiment that I've been working with over time. So with the I Hotel, one of the experiments that I wanted to work with was literary in the sense of thinking about who are our Asian American narrative voices. And so I was trying to make an attempt to, in each of the novellas, and there are 10 of them, there are 9 voices. Well, there are 10 voices, one that drops out and you never hear it again. But who indeed have we been using in our literature to speak for us? You know, and what do those voices sound like? What's the Nisei voice? What's the Chinese American voice? So those were kinds of experiments that I was working with the book. I think that I'm done with that experiment, but I don't know. I mean, I've taken it pretty far, but I've learned a great deal about that in terms of writing, and it's also been part of my teaching because I teach creative writing at UC Santa Cruz. So I've been thinking about how to transmit that the kind of freedom that you can feel within the restrictions of knowing what the voice is, and also the way you can corrupt it or change it or control it.
So as far as somebody picking this work up and who's not Asian American or has any vested interest in that, how would you feel they would negotiate the book?
They don't have to know that. I mean, that's my experiment as a writer. It's a further question for those people who are more savvy about reading all this literature, because this book is also a culmination of a lot of history of Asian American literature. I mean, the literary story or our literary history that begins in the 60s is in this book. And it's satirized and celebrated in many ways, I think. But you don't have to know this. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would hope that the book could be read on many different levels. You could just read it as stories.
And it's an amazing compilation because it really has so much depth. And I think anybody who didn't know the history of Asian American would be kind of a little bit floored, so to speak, about God, this is really going on.
That so many people did so many things. Yeah. I think that's also the feeling I got. That's why it took so long to research it, because I couldn't find the thread. I was trying to look for a thread for a novel that would take me, across all this material, and I couldn't. That's why the book became so large, because it's actually 10 novels in one novel. And I couldn't settle on one story that would really encompass sort of the broadness and the layered and multiple events that were happening at the same time. And this is just in San Francisco. We're not, I don't talk about going up. And I did come to Seattle and interview people. I talked to people in Seattle, and I wondered if the story had to be over here. I was also in Los Angeles. I also went out to New York. I looked at all the bridge material from the basement project there. I went to see the Cordobas here, and we talked about the Filipino community in the International District.
Yeah,
there was so much that threw itself at this one space, and had consequences for other locations in the world. And it's there, but it's not there. The folks who came from New York, like you, they're in the book. And I think you'll see that. But they don't say that they're from New York, but the stories are there. There's stories of their traveling to San Francisco and to continuing their work in San Francisco. That's in the book. So it was something that was both national, but then had to be focused in some way.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of was the natural centerpiece to be in the Bay Area. Because I know in the International District here, there were all the SROs, and it's very similar kind of setup as far as, community activisms. There's a lot of clinics and organizations that started in the early 70s, just about the same time. And what happened up here was the kingdom, the whole usurpation of property to build this gigantic stadium where all Asians live. Oh, we don't need this land. We can just build this thing here. We already put the I-5 highway right through the center of it.
That's right. That's right. This story, I think that's also one of the reasons why I made the hotel the center of the book, because this is redevelopment happened in every urban site, and it was inflicted on people of color in every urban site. So it seemed to be political and economic center that had to be talked about. And so I think it's recognizable in many sites. I think you're right.
Well, our time is just about up, and I have tons more questions, but we're going to have to leave it at that. And the book is I Hotel, novel by Karen Tei Yamashita. And be sure to check it out. It's about 600 pages, but it kind of flies by. Believe me, I kind of got the book the other day, and I had to do some white heat reading, and it just kind of goes.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here on this edition of Literary News.
Thank you so much.
If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you qualify for our services, visit WTBBL.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-615-0400 or toll free at 800-542-0866. This episode of Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library based in Seattle, Washington. Today's interview was conducted by John Pai. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.
Every story deserves to be heard, and everyone deserves access to it. The Washington Talking Book and Braille Library provides audiobooks, Braille, and reading support for people across the state who can't read standard print. That car, truck, or boat you're not using anymore can help fund those services. Donate your vehicle today. Pickup is free, running or not. Start now at careasy.org/WTBBL.